Happy hunting on Baden Hill, and here we are again. We've come to the 5th installment of our Reds unit. I'm hoping that you understand why the Russian revolutions, remember there were 2 of them, why the Russian revolutions happened, how they happened, and then I also hope you understand that there were serious effects, not just within Russia, but around the world. One of the main effects that the Russian Revolution had on the rest of the world was the fact that Lenin had always had a slogan: peace, land, bread. The first item in that series, peace, meant that Russians were sick and tired of fighting a war that was someone else's war. Remember, Russia had come to the aid of ally Serbia. It had been a noble cause in the minds of many people. And most Russians had supported it at the beginning, but because the government was mismanaging so much and didn't even give weapons to the soldiers, but just sent them out to be slaughtered, that war became incredibly unpopular. After the first Russian Revolution in February/March of 1917, the provisional government took control of the country, and many of the people in the provisional government were those bourgeoisie, the middle class, educated elite. They were people who wanted some of the power that the Tsar had taken for himself. Remember, the Tsar was an autocracy, a leader who kept power for himself. And as a result, the bourgeoisie wanted to overthrow him. But the working class still didn't have a lot of power. And so people like Lenin always said that there would be a second revolution. Well, the provisional government stayed in World War I, and they explained that they had to defend Russia's revolution against other countries like Germany, who would seek to restore the monarchy. So, peace wasn't going to come with the provisional government. As a result, in October/November of 1917, you had the second revolution. We'll call it the Communist Revolution. And the first revolution, I'll call it the Socialist Revolution. And after the second revolution, it would seem like everything would be happily ever after, and everyone could live in peace and harmony. Immediately, once Lenin took power, remember, he was basically the head of the Communist Party, and so when the Bolsheviks took over the government, he was almost automatically elected to be the head of the government. We'll call him president or the premier. He was the one in charge. And because of this, he immediately negotiated a peace treaty with Germany to get out of the war, and that was called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and it ended Russian participation in the war. Well, that meant that the Allies, specifically France, the UK, and the United States, which had joined the war in 1917, those countries were in deep trouble. Part of the way that they were able to keep Germany from defeating France was they had 2 fronts to the war. There was an eastern front between Germany and Russia, and a western front, which is maybe the one that we know best because it was carving up Europe with its trench network, and it basically was the line of defense keeping France from being overrun by Germany. And so once the Russians pulled out of the war, the Allies had to re-establish the Eastern Front and keep Germany on its toes, keep Germany from just overpowering France. So one thing that happened because of the Bolshevik Revolution is those people who supported the Tsar, they had to basically retreat, find places to hide, go to other countries, regroup, go to the fringes of what was the Russian Empire and was now a Russian socialist republic. They had to go to the borders, and basically they had to figure out what to do next. We'll call that group the White Russians. The White Russians were supporters of the Tsar. This color, white, has often been used to show anti-communism or conservatism. So it's counter-revolutionary. That's the color white. The color red, we already know, is the color of communism and revolution. So the White Russians were supporters of the Tsar, and the Red Russians were supporters of the Bolsheviks and Lenin. And this was not going to end happily. It was going to end in a civil war. One of the main players in this story of the Russian Civil War, which began right away in 1918, one of the main players was General Kornilov. Remember that he had a run-in with Kerensky, Prime Minister Kerensky, who ordered him to go to St. Petersburg, but then called him back, and Kornilov kept going. And he didn't commit an army massacre in St. Petersburg. Instead, he kind of worked together with the revolutionaries there, but he was punished by Kerensky. Eventually, during the chaos of 1917, he was able to escape. But that didn't mean that he supported the revolutionaries. He was still a traditional Russian in his heart. And so Kornilov was the leader of the White Russian forces who were fighting against the Red Russian forces, the Bolsheviks, in the Russian Civil War. We will say that this Civil War lasted from 1918 until 1922. Now, that is expanding what we call the Civil War, and I'll talk about that in another segment. But for right now, just know that Kornilov, he was this general who was leading White Russian forces, but the White Russians were at a serious disadvantage. And we'll talk about that in the next slide as well. Just know that Kornilov, he was kind of on his last legs as a leader. He had served under one group, and now he was fighting to restore that group. And basically, it was a big mess. And Kornilov was caught in between. Eventually, he was killed at Katarinodar. Katarinodar is, again, it's a city like St. Petersburg, named in connection to one of the czars. And Catherine the Great was the wife of Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great became a great figure in Russian history as well. So Katarinodar is where he died. Now, this civil war isn't just Russians fighting Russians, and that goes for almost every civil war in the world. We think of our U.S. Civil War. We know that it was the North fighting the South. But we also know that many European powers were interested in influencing the war. And so France and the UK, they were doing a lot during the U.S. Civil War to meddle. But remember, they had to remain on good terms with whoever won the war. So they kind of played both sides. Well, the Allies, meaning the powers of Western Europe who had fought in World War I, we're talking UK, France, and the United States. Also Japan. Remember, Japan joined the war, and they wanted to be a player ever since the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, when they got Taiwan and some colonies, and then the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, and so Japan is involved in World War I. And what happened is there was an invasion of Russia. That Allies, they said they just simply wanted to make sure that the people in Eastern Europe who were fighting against the Germans, that they had supplies. But their underlying idea was they wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks. So they wanted to have a revolution against the revolutionaries. And so this is called the North Russia intervention. Intervention, it's an invasion, but it basically is like a referee in a basketball game getting in the middle when two players are fighting or two teams are fighting. The referee was the Allies, but they also were siding with the traditions of Russia and a more stable government than the Bolsheviks. And so part of that North Russia intervention was getting the United States to send troops. So it's funny, I grew up with the idea that someday the Russians are going to invade the United States, and we were all scared of communism coming to the US, when in reality, it was the United States who invaded communist Russia. And that happened at this time in 1918. And General Pershing was a big part of that involvement as well. Remember, he was in charge of the forces, the Allied forces in World War I. So the Polar Bear expedition is what the U.S. involvement is called. And there are two places that were invaded, where American troops and other European troops landed in Russia. And the first one is Vladivostok. Remember, that was the cold water port way up on the northeast of Russia. And then there's also Arkhangelsk, which is Archangel in English. Archangel is pretty much the highest, the northernmost city in Russia. And so there were U.S. troops in those two places, basically trying to invade Russia through Siberia. So the Polar Bear expedition, it wasn't successful. It didn't achieve its goals, and eventually just the disarray of the White Russian forces, that led to the United States having to pull out. And it's a war that I didn't learn about, meaning I didn't learn about the U.S. involvement in the Russian Civil War until later in my life, because Russia was always supposed to be the enemies invading us. So one thing to know is that Japan held on. Okay, remember, Japan is supporting the Allies from the East, and they have had this war with Russia in 1904, 1905. Well, there is an island called Sakhalin. Sakhalin is the largest island on the east coast of Russia. You can see it clearly on a map, but it's obviously very cold. Japan took it over during that Russian Civil War, and Russia didn't get it back until the end of World War II. So 30 years of being controlled by Japan as Japan continued to expand its influence. So pretty briefly here, I want to talk about how the Civil War in Russia progressed. We have the Red Russians, which is pretty much everybody who can't overthrow the Bolsheviks. Many peasants and workers are supporting the Bolsheviks, but they've already started to feel that their efforts are going toward the gain of someone else. This sounds just like it was with the Russian monarchy and the nobles, and then all the serfs who were working their tails off to support someone else. So what happened is all the peasants and the workers, they were supporting the revolution, but then during the start of the war, it was clear that the Bolsheviks were going to demand that the farmers give their food to the cause of the war. And so the food was given to the workers in the cities, and those workers were working in factories producing armaments, weapons for the war, and also to the soldiers themselves. So the farmers sometimes were left with not even enough to eat, and there was a massive famine at this time. And so just know you have all these reds, but you also have whites, and now the armies of the Reds outnumbered the whites. It was really 2-1. And we'll talk about that in a second, but just know there were quite a few people around the edges who did not want the Bolsheviks to stay in power, and so we'll call them the whites. And the white forces, they are fighting to regain control of Russia. So who suffered in this war? It was the everyday people. The casualties of war were the same as they had always been. It wasn't the leaders who died. It was the everyday people. There were 9 million people who died during the Russian Civil War. 9 million people. In addition, cities like St. Petersburg went from 4 million people to 1.5 million people, so cut even more than in half. And part of that is people fleeing the violence, so it's not just that they were killed in the cities, but it's a terrible, terrible conflict. And remember, there was famine. There was also massive, massive disease, plague. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed more people worldwide than all the people who had died in battles in World War I. And remember, 1918 is when the World War I ended, and that's when the plague, we'll call it a plague, that's when the Spanish flu spread all over the world in an epidemic, a pandemic. And it's interesting. It apparently started from soldiers who were being treated in Kansas, at Fort Funston in Kansas. And so from the center of the United States, Spanish flu spread all over the world. We don't know exactly how it spread. It wasn't a time where people were flying all over the world, and so it's pretty remarkable that the Spanish flu spread like it did. So 9 million people died, and Russia was destroyed. So just after it gotten the hope of a revolution and a new day, the whole country is destroyed. Well, the leadership is still in place, and they see it as an opportunity to just rebuild from the ashes in their own image. They want to make Russia their own way. And so basically they are creating a new empire. It's not just Russia. Remember, it's the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, at one point it included Poland, and certainly it included Finland. It included all kinds of places that we call republics today. And so in 1922, on the stage of the Bolshoi Theater, where they have the world famous ballets, that's where the USSR was declared, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. From that point forward, there was a lot of change that had to take place. The central government was commanding the economy. So it was not an economy that depended on supply and demand. Supply means all the things that are made, and then demand means whether people want them or not. A command economy is not a market economy. A command economy says that the government decides how much to produce, and then the workers have to produce that, even if people don't want it. They don't have choice in what they are able to buy or use. They just simply get whatever the government gives them. The one thing that's supposed to happen in communism is that everybody has food to eat. That didn't happen through this time. So you had a command economy, and that meant massive industrialization, move to the cities, build factories. But after World War I, the factories started declining because they weren't producing weapons anymore. And so as that happened, and as the Civil War wound down, the factories weren't able to do their job, and people lost their jobs, and then they didn't have any food to eat. And so that was one side of it, the industrialization side. The other side is agriculture. There was a collectivization that was required by the government. And that meant that that individual farm owners, they lost their farms. And back when the government started messing with farmers, the farmers decided, okay, we're just not going to grow food then. If you're going to take our food and give it to the workers and the soldiers, we're not going to grow food. Eventually, though, what food they did grow was taken from them and they were made to starve. This in Animal Farm is represented by those hens whose eggs were taken and then basically they were executed. In real life, they were just starved to death, many of them. This is Stalin's Soviet Union. After Lenin's death, Stalin took over, and Stalin was the one who moved Russia into the future, kicking and screaming and dying. Specifically, in the late 1930s, there was an incident called the Great Purge or the Great Terror. And this was Stalin's way to get rid of all of the wealthy people, the wealthy landowners, get rid of military who were not loyal to him, basically get rid of any rivals he had in the communist government. And so that Great Purge, it is just a reminder that even when you have an overthrow or a revolution against someone in power, someone else will step into that power vacuum. Now, I wanted to mention 4 factors that led to the White Russians losing to the Red Russians, and we can use an acronym WORK, W-O-R-K, because you might wonder, why didn't the White Russians win? We talked already about the fact that they didn't have as many soldiers as the Red Russians. So that wasn't only about soldiers, it was about weapons. So that's the W. Weapons and resources, because the Red Army was taking over everything that was a part of the provisional government, and Russia has tons of resources. So at this point, there were more weapons on the Red Army side than the White Army. That's weapons. O is organization. The Red Army was able to coordinate its troops because it was centralized. It had central organization, and that meant that the ethnic background of the fighters was mostly the same. They were mostly Russian. The White Russians, the White armies, were made up of people along the outside of Russia who were a different ethnic group. And you can think of the Baltic republics, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, also people from Ukraine who were somewhat different from the Russians. And as a result, it was very difficult to coordinate all of those different revolutionary groups. The White Russian armies were cobbled together. They were put together. They weren't all Russian and centralized. So that's organization. Now R, the region, just simply the fact that, again, this is connected to the organization. The region was the Red armies were basically fighting in the center of the country, and the White Russians were spread out all along the outside. So the region or the geographic location was very important. The White Russians had to fight from the edges. And finally, K stands for keeping control. Keeping control is different from trying to gain control. And the Red Army was fighting for the Bolsheviks, and they were the governing body, and they had had time to get organized. Remember the Soviets, the grassroots organizations, they were all organizing the country, but the White Russians were basically seen as invaders. And so that keeping control is what led the Red armies to victory. We've already talked quite a bit about Vladimir Lenin and Karl Marx. So we understand that Marxist Leninism was the communism that the Bolsheviks promoted and started the Soviet Union with. But the man that we really need to know now is Joseph Stalin. Stalin is represented in Animal Farm by the pig Napoleon. It's not a coincidence that his name is Napoleon, because Stalin seemed to be a hero to the people. He had fought for communism from the beginning, but he was a bully, and he was someone who did not seem to have the same kind of values that some of the other leaders had, some of the other revolutionaries who simply wanted the workers to have a better life. Well, Stalin started his life in kind of a rough situation. His father was an alcoholic. Eventually, he was rescued from the beatings that he and his mother were receiving. And again, that has a huge impact on a person. And so maybe it doesn't make excuses for him, but maybe it helps us understand how people, when they are responding to the abuse they've received, they become abusers. And so Joseph Stalin, he was rescued by a churchman, a person in the church, and sent to a school for the children of priests. Now, remember, this is the Russian Orthodox Church, and priests could marry and have children. So he was put into a situation with the children of church people, and it seems like it should have been a good education. And from what we can tell, it was. He learned a lot. He was a pretty good scholar at the beginning, and he was on the track to become a priest. He was in a seminary as a seminary student. A seminary is where pastors are trained. He was being trained for the priesthood, but then something snapped. He started rising up against what was going on at the school, and he wouldn't do his work. And finally, he said he was an atheist and didn't believe in God at all. And he didn't continue. Instead, he started getting involved in a lot of workers' organizations, just like Lenin, and he rose up through the ranks. He was from Georgia, which is in the Transcaucasus region. Okay, it's the region that is close to Europe. It's Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, those areas, and it's close to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. All right, so he had a Georgian background. He wasn't Russian, he was Georgian. And this is important because ethnicity, your background, makes a difference to people. And a lot of times people fight when they have a different background. Let me talk just a little bit about some important aspects of Stalin's life. After Joseph Stalin left the seminary, he was working with workers' groups. He was put in prison. He was exiled to Siberia. He tried to escape several times from Siberia, and eventually he was successful. This, again, it sounds like other stories. It sounds like the story of Lenin and Trotsky, who we'll talk about next. He became the editor of Pravda, and this is a newspaper that started in 1912. We've already discussed it a little bit. Its name means truth. It was the Bolshevik communist newspaper. And you might wonder, why did all these leaders want to be working at a newspaper? Well, that was the way to communicate with so many people around the country and around the world. And so he continued as the editor of Pravda, and he gained popularity and influence. And eventually, he was invited by Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky, by the way, had been the one in command of the Red Army during the Civil War. We'll talk about him next. Lenin and Trotsky invited Stalin to be a part of what was called the Central Committee. The Central Committee of the Communist Party was the governing body, and they were the ones, the visionaries, the ones who oversaw everything. And so now Stalin is being allowed into the inner circle. And there was another organization that began during the Russian Civil War, and it's called the Politburo. The Politburo is the political bureau, the political organizing body that responds instantly in a very quick way to what's going on. So you have the Central Committee over the Politburo, but the Politburo is the one that is basically on the ground dealing with situations. There was a tension between the Central Committee and the Politburo. When Lenin died in 1924, he died because of an assassination attempt in 1918, and that actually led to some strokes that he had, and he died eventually in 1924. He did write many things about Stalin, saying that he didn't trust Stalin, he didn't want Stalin to have the chairmanship of the Communist Party and to rise to be the dictator of Russia. And so this is a very important thing to see, that Lenin also saw the writing on the wall. He saw what was coming, and he knew that Stalin would be a terrible dictator of the country. Well, keep in mind that Stalin was the one behind the command economy and the collectivization and the industrialization. And he basically, along with Lenin and Trotsky, they had come up with the idea from 1920 to 1935, they were going to create electricity throughout the country. And that was a huge development, and it was actually very successful. Think of Animal Farm, Snowball, and his idea of building the windmill to generate electricity. That represents this period, and it actually went faster than they thought it would. This then led to 5-year plans where they had a goal for 5 years, what they wanted to accomplish. And Stalin kept implementing these 5-year plans, forcing the country to industrialize, forcing the peasants to become industrial workers, collectivizing the farms. And you know that, again, that led to famine and starvation. But Stalin was in charge, and his iron fist led to purging of his enemies and his rivals, and also oppression over his own people. We think about the secret police represented by the dogs in Animal Farm. It started with the Okhrana, which was under the Tsar. The Okhrana were the secret police. Then, after the revolution, Lenin kept the secret police and called it the Cheka. So Okhrana, Cheka, and now we have a new secret police that is keeping people down. It's called the NKVD, and we'll hear more about that next. So I've mentioned his name a couple of times. It's important to know Leo Trotsky, or Leon Trotsky, or Lev Trotsky. You need to know that Trotsky is not his real name. He was born Lev Bronstein, and he eventually adopted the name Trotsky. And many of these Bolsheviks, the communists, before they were in power, they had to go into exile, go into hiding, run from the police, because they threatened the government. And so they used aliases, fake names. Well, Lev Bronsky became Trotsky. He started out as a revolutionary, but he was more a Menshevik than a Bolshevik. Interestingly enough, in Georgia, where Stalin lived, the Mensheviks had a lot of power. Even after the Russian Revolution, the Menshevik Party was controlling Georgia until finally the Russian army put down the Mensheviks and established the Bolshevik rule. So remember, the Mensheviks, the name means minority, Bolshevik means majority, but it just meant that the Bolsheviks were the ones who wanted violent upheaval and rebellion, and the Mensheviks wanted more internationalism, working with organizations, helping workers have a better life, and yes, overthrowing the government eventually through protests and a slightly less violent uprising. Well, gradually, the Bolsheviks became the party of Stalin, and anybody who was a Menshevik was less inclined to Stalin's way of thinking. Okay? Trotsky, because of his revolutionary activities in the early 1900s, remember, even before the revolution of 1905 and Sunday Bloody Sunday, Trotsky was arrested and exiled to Siberia, just like Lenin, just like Stalin. He escaped. He was with his wife, and they escaped in a covered wagon. By the way, Stalin tried to escape by disguising himself as a woman. So they tried anything to escape from the police eyes that were watching them in Siberia. And Siberia is really far away, and so escapes did happen. Now you might ask, why didn't they put them in prison. Why did they send them into exile? I think it was to show that they didn't have to. They weren't afraid of these revolutionaries. They could send them far away and they would be irrelevant. Well, Trotsky didn't stay in Siberia. He escaped, but then he ended up having to go other places. He couldn't stay in Russia. He was basically, he returned to help with the revolutions. In fact, he actually did most of the work getting ready for the October-November Revolution. He was the one who should get the credit, and then he commanded the forces during the Civil War. But once Lenin died, Trotsky again had to go into exile in 1927. He had been working together with Stalin. So Stalin and Trotsky and others were together in what's called a troika. A troika is distributed leadership, so you don't have one person taking charge. And again, Lenin saw that Stalin was going to try to take charge of the whole country by himself. So instead, they had about 3 people, and Trotsky was one of them. And eventually, Stalin, in 1927, he got rid of the other 2 by exiling them from the country, by declaring that they were actually counter-revolutionaries. And so Trotsky had to leave Russia. He went to France. He was in Norway. But in Norway, there were some attacks on him. Remember the secret police we talked about, the NKVD? They were working internationally. They could go to other countries and they could carry out terrorist attacks or assassination attempts. And so there was an attack where he was staying in Norway, and finally he was forced to travel all the way to Mexico. And he stayed with 2 painters, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. These 2 painters were extremely well known. They were socialist in their thinking. They wanted the same kinds of things as Trotsky. He came to their home, and it was at that time in 1920 that basically he was living with them and writing books promoting his ideas of Trotskyism as opposed to Stalinism, and he was denouncing Stalin. And so this continued all the way till 1936. So he was staying in Mexico. Trotsky was staying in Mexico. Sorry, I think I said 1920. That's not correct. It was 1930s, and then 1936, he published against Stalin, and Stalin basically declared that he was guilty and should be executed. And so there were attacks made on his home where he was staying, and finally one of those attacks succeeded. But Trotsky fought off his assassins. He fought them. He was actually hit with an ice hammer or ice pick, and it didn't kill him, and he was able to, his bodyguards, because he did have bodyguards, they actually captured the prisoner for interrogation to find out what was going on. But Trotsky only survived another day, and then he died from his wounds. And so he was assassinated in Mexico by Stalin's NKVD secret police. And we know that Stalin has his grip on the Soviet Union, and we also know that Russia is expanding to become a new empire. Right away in 1918, when the USSR was declared, there were already other groups that were sucked into this union. And those groups, there were 4 areas, we'll call them countries, although today they're not exactly the same countries. Ukraine, which is right next to Russia, Belarus, also called Byelorussian sometimes, and the Transcaucasus, which includes the republics of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia that we've talked about. And those three, I'm sorry if I said the wrong number, those three were forced together in a union, a communist union called the USSR. But it didn't end there. There were three very small republics in the northeast of Russia on the Baltic Sea. Those are called the Baltic republics, and they are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. There was a communist revolution there, and those three republics became communist in 1918. But during the Russian Civil War, the people there, they didn't want the communist government, and so they overthrew the communist government in those three republics. But Stalin eventually won the Civil War and was able to regain control of those three republics all the way until 1991. Those republics did not want to be a part of the Soviet Union, the USSR, but they had to be. And finally, the Soviet Union grew to include areas that were not Russian, but Russia wanted some protection from any potential enemies. And so they took over republics, areas that had been controlled by the czars, but loosely. And these are the stands. There are 5 countries that you need to know that end in stan. We're not talking about Pakistan and Afghanistan. Those are right in that same area. And that the word stan means kingdom, and it comes from the Mongols spreading all across Asia and leaving that legacy. So the 5 stands, we're going to call them tuk-tuk, okay? Tuk-tuk is actually a restaurant that I like, and it has to do with like a little vehicle in Thailand. T-U-K is how you say tuk, but this is T-U-K-T-K, all right? These are the letters that start the 5 stands, the names. So it's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Those are the 5 stands. And I would challenge you to memorize them too, just because they all get lumped together. They are different from each other, but there's a lot of Muslim influence in those areas left over from the Mongol conquests. The USSR did not end there, and they continued through the process of World War II, expanding westward into Eastern Europe and bringing down the Iron Curtain. And we've learned about the Eastern European countries that had formerly been, basically today they're independent of Russia, but there's still some lingering influence. And that the places like Czechia and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria and places like that. But there's also Eastern Asia. We can't forget that at the end of World War II, Japan lost its grip on some of the places in the East, and so the USSR expanded even into the East and into North Korea. North Korea was established by the Soviet Union. We need to remember that. I will never forget growing up and seeing the dominance in the Olympics by the USSR, and on their jerseys, the clothes for their sports, they always wore CCCP, and that is the USSR in Russian. So in my mind, I will remember the CCCP, I will remember its power, and I will remember how quickly the world changed at the end of the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Thanks for watching.